Good evening and welcome to The Access. Tonight we'll be discussing the Israeli airstrikes against Hezbollah, Hezbollah's activities in Latin America, and the presence of Hezbollah in the United States. We will be discussing these issues with our guest, Josef Humire, Executive Director for the Center for a Secure Free Society, and EJ Kimball, National Security Analyst at the Middle East Forum. Thank you so much, both EJ and Joseph, for joining us today. Today's topic is going to be Hezbollah. Hezbollah. A lot is going on. We know the escalation that's happening in the region as we speak. We're not sure how things are going to be going from this point, but Israel has been striking Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies openly in the region, including Iraq. I'm not sure if that was confirmed by Israel, but we know that there are strikes all over. And there were some people speculating that that might lead into an open war. Let's start by this development here. What do you believe this means, especially that also there's the elections that are going to be happening in Israel very soon? What are the implications of this escalation that's happening very rapidly in the region against Hezbollah mainly and other proxies by Iran?
Well, first, thanks for having us on the show. It's good to be back on.
It's great to have you.
Yes. The implications for the election, I don't believe are so important. What's recently happened is the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has required that Benny Gantz, the head of the Blue-White Party, the major opposition in this upcoming election, to be given the same security briefings that he's receiving. Typically that happens when there is a major operation ongoing or a major operation that's about to begin. So I think what we're seeing right now is the beginnings of a major operation to combat Iranian influence throughout the region, and really the realization from the Israelis that the Iranian presence close to Israel's border, while originally hoped that it would be temporary and the Russians would eject Iran out from southern Syria, this realization that Iran is probably going to have a permanent presence near Israel's border, which of course is untenable for Israeli security interests. Regarding the election, the security issues, Benny Gantz is a former chief of staff. Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly has been fighting this war as prime minister for 10 years. It should not have a major implication on the election, but of course, if there's a major operation going on, typically the electorate will want to keep the party that's running the campaign rather than switching.
Yes. Joseph, do you have a comment on this? I mean, what's the implications of that on Hezbollah specifically, and your focus on Hezbollah issues?
No, again, thank you for the invitation. I echo what EJ says. I think what we're seeing in Iran and with Hezbollah, I kind of put them in a package deal because they tend to work in tandem. You're seeing a bit of a wounded dog syndrome. Both of them are suffering economically, not just because of sanctions, but also, particularly in Iran, because of their own domestic economic decisions that they've made. They've overpromised on the benefits of the nuclear deal that didn't pay the dividends that they thought they were, particularly with the Iranian people. And so what you're seeing is a weak Iran economically, a weak Iran politically in terms of the youth that's rising in Iran. And what that means is that they're becoming more aggressive abroad. They're attacking more in Iraq, they're attacking more in Syria, they're activating Hezbollah, not just in the border with Israel, but I think around the world. Hezbollah has a global presence, particularly in Latin America. And so I think what you're seeing is you're seeing Iran become much more aggressive because they're worried, much like the Ayatollahs are worried about their domestic situation at home. At any minute, another revolution could get sparked within Iran, and this time it would be against them.
Can I build on that? Because what Joseph's making that point that a lot of people view Iran in the way that they're acting as being very strong, in spite of the maximum pressure campaign being thrust upon them by this administration. But it's an act of desperation, and while Iran is trying to project strength, whether they enter into negotiations with the U.S. on a new deal or not, they're trying to project some type of strength. But when it comes to Israel, Israel's not going to sit back and allow Iran to try to project strength without responding to it. And so in their attempts to show that they're still very strong, Israel is countering it, and it's causing Iran to sort of back into a corner where either they need to sort of withdraw what they're doing or to escalate, which of course an escalation can lead to an open conflict.
And we have been seeing this type of escalation in terms of Hezbollah's activities because in Idlib, where there is the conflict going on right now, the Russian continuous airstrikes and the Assad regime airstrikes against the people of this very small geographical area, there was Hezbollah forces reported on the ground. We haven't seen that escalation by Hezbollah forces in a while. Is that also an act of desperation by Hezbollah? Are they in a tight corner as well? Because you're talking about the Iranian regime, but what about Hezbollah? Inside of Lebanon, we know that they've been becoming even more powerful within the government and within the army.
Well, Hezbollah has gained political points in Lebanon, particularly since the last election. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah does respond to Iranian interests, and they were started this way. They continue this way. They maintain this way. And I think the myth that Hezbollah only cares about the Lebanese population and support the Lebanese resistance has been broken. It's been broken with the Syrian civil war. It's been broken with the Houthi rebels in Yemen. It's been broken in Iraq. It's been broken in Latin America. So we've kind of all seen that Hezbollah is a rapid reaction force for Iran. And so when Iran says, Hezbollah, we need you to mobilize and deploy to this area of operation because we need you to provide any kind of training, support, actions, Hezbollah responds. And that's because I think they're dependent on the financing. Hezbollah has gotten in diversified money from illicit activities all throughout the world, but at the end of the day, they still have to depend logistically on that land bridge that goes from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq into Iran. And because of that, they are beholden to the interests of the Islamic Republic.
In your opinion, EJ, now we see that the Lebanese army is stepping in. They're striking Israeli drones. I mean, is that becoming more open about the amount of infiltration by Hezbollah militia into the Lebanese army? Or is that, becoming basically a Lebanon versus Israel war and not Hezbollah versus Israel war?
Well, it's a combination because as Hezbollah has been working within the Lebanese government, they've gained more and more influence and control. And so Congress has, Senator Ted Cruz has legislation that to deal specifically with the funding of the Lebanese armed forces, because the distinction between the armed forces and Hezbollah has been blurred, if not completely gone. So when you see the Lebanese armed forces now acting in response to Israel, I don't think it's a distinction where we've got Hezbollah, we've got Israel, and we've got the Lebanese armed forces. The Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah are combined into one. And so they're acting out of necessity because of the control that Hezbollah is able to assert within it. So yes, this is something that is coming to a head. And Israel versus Lebanon, it's more about Iran and Hezbollah taking over Lebanon to use, instead of a proxy army, it's a proxy government and proxy country.
So it's an occupied Lebanon by Hezbollah and the proxy of Iran. And you just mentioned very important point, and that's what I want to talk about to both of you, about the new measurements by the American administration trying to counter that influence in Lebanon. There's a support to the Lebanese army by the American government. This administration has continued these efforts, but there were some sanctions against some members of the Lebanese parliament that are affiliated with Hezbollah. In your opinion, I mean, are these steps enough, and what do they mean for this ongoing support to the Lebanese army that is clearly not behaving and conducting itself as an independent, country defending entity, but a proxy to another hostile force?
No, correct. I think what the United States is trying to do is they're trying to wedge Hezbollah out. They understand that they gained political force through this last election. They got more proximity with the Lebanese government, but they're trying to wedge that relationship. I agree with EJ. I think Iran is countering that. And Iran is countering that by using other movements. Historically, the Amal movement has always been very close. The Socialist Party of Lebanon has already been close to build that coalition around Hezbollah in the Lebanese parliament and then dovetail that with the Lebanese government, the Lebanese prime minister. However, I would say that the pressure, it does tend to work. And what we've seen with Hezbollah is their financial mechanisms have been limited. Because they get money not just from their legitimate or their internal fundraising mechanisms, they also get money from narcotics. They get money from laundering operations, trafficking operations all over the world. And so the Department of Justice in particular has taken a huge step in trying to limit that illicit finance mechanism to squeeze them quite a bit more. Because when the way Hezbollah tended to operate in Lebanon was they used corruption. They use corrupt politicians, they use corrupt mechanisms within the Lebanese government, and they co-opt it by providing sweeteners, business sweeteners, financial sweeteners. But if you give them less ability to finance themselves, they have less ability to pay off politicians in Lebanon. So the U.S. Department of Justice, the Trump administration, has taken, I think, real hard measures to clamp down on Hezbollah's global financial network. The Department of Treasury calls it Hezbollah Inc., Hezbollah Incorporated, because it's Hezbollah at the top, and like any multi-national firm, and all these subsidiaries all over the world.
All over the world.
And so they're trying to squeeze down on the main operation.
EJ, do you think this is enough? I mean, these new measurements, obviously we're seeing that Hezbollah is lashing out, maybe out of weakness, maybe out of desperation, but are these measurements enough? And what else could the American administration do? And should the funding continue to the Lebanese army at this point?
Well, at this point, to answer the last question first, no. The funding should not continue to the Lebanese armed forces there. But the administration is doing a lot, and there is more that the administration is looking to do, but it's happening in a staged process right now to continue to exert this pressure. But then you've also got the complicated factor about Israel, and the stronger the response, the sanctions within Lebanon raises the risk of an all-out conflict that, not that Israel isn't prepared for it, but you don't want to sort of thrust that right now in the region and in a sense, force the issue. So this incremental process is having a big effect. It's having the intended effect that the administration is looking for, but there is still a lot more to be done in order to combat it.
I want to talk about the Center for Secure and Free Society event that I attended at the Congress. It was thrown by you guys, Center for Secure and Free Society, and Joseph, you're part of it, which focused on Hezbollah's activities in South America, specifically Argentina. The previous terrorist attack against a synagogue, and obviously the continuation of the financial and terrorist activities throughout Central and South America. Tell us a little bit more about these new steps and measurements by the Argentinian government, and what do they mean for Hezbollah in that part of the world?
Yeah, well, I think to tie this to what we were talking about in terms of the conflicts in the Middle East is what the United States is trying to do, and I think it's not just the United States, is what the international community needs to do, is they need to put everybody on the same language. You know, when we talk about Iran or we talk about Hezbollah, there's different interpretations of what Iran and Hezbollah is. Specifically on Hezbollah, there's, prior to July of this year, there's 57 countries around the world that have designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. None of those countries are in Latin America, where they carried out one of the most successful terrorist operations in the history of Hezbollah, which is when they bombed the Amia Cultural Center, which you mentioned, in 1994, killing 85 Argentines. That kind of showed, just to go back in time a little bit, that showed that, remember this is 1994, that at the time nobody believed Hezbollah operated outside the Middle East. They said Hezbollah doesn't have any interest anywhere other than Lebanon or they're near abroad. Well, 1994 showed that they're not just active in Lebanon and near abroad, they're active all the way to the other side of the world, very close to the United States and South America. So what the Macri government did in Argentina was they finally, after 25 years, officially recognized Hezbollah for what we all know them to be, which is a foreign terrorist organization. They became the 58th country. And a matter of fact, just a few weeks after that, on August 9th, the Paraguayan government, which is the neighboring country, also recognized Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations through their own executive decree. So what we're seeing now is a momentum building in Latin America, where governments in Latin America are seriously weighing and considering designating Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which clears up the confusion. It clears up this language of, oh, Hezbollah is a political party, or Hezbollah has a social movement, or Hezbollah is a resistance element in Lebanon.
Was that the reputation of Hezbollah in these countries before?
Either that, or just didn't know what Hezbollah was. I mean, complete ignorance, since it's all the way on the other side of the world. So there was a lot of ignorance, but for the folks that did know, they tended to move more towards the political elements of Hezbollah in Lebanon and didn't really think the terrorist element affected them. Or there was an element of understanding Hezbollah's illicit operations, their involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering. I'll give you an example. I'm still an expert witness to a Hezbollah trial in Peru. And the individual that's accused in Peru, who's now under a trial with the Supreme Court, when it was the previous federal court in Peru, the first question the judge asked when he was trying this individual, the first question he asked was, what is Hezbollah? And he
So
had
he didn't even know.
He had
the
no idea.
judge,
He did
if
not,
you're-
never heard of it. The individual, since there wasn't a terrorist attack committed, he was accused of planning a terrorist attack. They weren't sure if he was actually doing this on behalf of a major terrorist organization, so they acquitted him of terror charges, and they only convicted him of his false passport. The Supreme Court annulled that decision in Peru, and so now he's re-going trial. But it's just to show you an example of kind of the level of ignorance that some countries in Latin America have towards Hezbollah. What the Argentine designation did is it cleared some of that up.
Exactly. So it's kind of leading the way towards more designations throughout the region. But Hezbollah operates in an undercover way. I mean, they're not really coming out saying we are Hezbollah. We did hear of actually their banners being and their flags being flown around. That was interesting enough. But could they also kind of go undercover again and just go back to being underground operations all over Central and South America, especially that the drug business is really hard to stop?
Well, and Joseph can answer this in greater detail, but Hezbollah is operating in some ways out in the open because they're not a designated terrorist organization. It's not illegal to be a member of Hezbollah. Now, of course, in Argentina and in Paraguay and hopefully in some other countries, that's going to change very soon. But they've acted in the open. Some of the illicit, drug trafficking, the trade, that stuff obviously is in many cases done underground. But that is a very real possibility that as this happens, they do go underground. And of course, there's the risk that they now view these essentially host countries where they've been operating as more hostile enemy terrain, where they may start to target attacks. But as a bigger point in your question about Hezbollah, I think the biggest implication of what this administration, the Trump administration, has done is they're getting rid of this blurred line between treating Iran and Hezbollah as distinct entities. They're not. Going after Hezbollah isn't because Hezbollah is attacking Israel and threatens Israeli interests around the world. It's because it is part of, as Joseph says, the rapid response team for the Iranian regime. That they are treating them as part of Iran, and so squeezing Hezbollah is squeezing Iran.
But just to pick up on that, I think if we look at the 1994 attack, and many would say that was 25 years ago, but there's a lot of significance to understanding the modus operandi of that attack. Why did Hezbollah attack Argentina, right? They had no enemies in Argentina. There was no hostilities between the Argentine government and Hezbollah at the time. They did it for one reason only, because Iran told it to do so. The reason Iran told it to do so was because Iran was upset with Argentina for canceling a nuclear agreement that they had. Iran's nuclear program, their heavy water reactors, were developed based off of the Argentine nuclear reactors that has a much more historic and significant nuclear program dating back into the 1970s. So in the 1980s, they shared this. 1990s, the Argentine government canceled it as part of their signing of the non-proliferation treaties, and then they got bombed twice. The Israeli embassy got bombed in 92, and then the Humire Culture Center in 94. Hezbollah carried out the attacks, but they did so under the guidance and order of Iran. So the significance of understanding how Hezbollah and Iran cooperate, interoperate, the Humire attacks a great blueprint to understand that, even though it was 25 years ago, because it hasn't changed significantly. What we're seeing now in Latin America, though, is that their presence has evolved. You mentioned what could the reaction be. Sure, in some countries they're going to go underground. I imagine in Argentina and Paraguay they're going to be less visible. However, they have countries now in Latin America where the top governments, we were talking about Lebanon a second ago, well, there's governments in Latin America that are beholden to Iranian and Hezbollah interests, such as Venezuela, such as Bolivia. So they have now third-party safe countries where they can retract over there, and they have the complete protection of the host nation government.
Okay. In terms of, when we look into that history right there, and we know that nothing have happened since then, after these two attacks against the Israeli embassy and then the cultural center, why did we, and I know that we're talking about, something that happened in the past, but this kind of tells us where we are today. Why did we not see any talk about designating them as terrorist organization, educating the public in these countries about what Hezbollah is? And by the American governments, the previous American administrations, that was a responsibility that was not taken on. I just want to try to understand what happened and why.
Well, a year ago, Joseph and I were in Argentina and meeting with some officials out there, and I met with some of the Jewish leaders in Argentina, and I talked to them specifically about the fact that here your country was attacked 25 years ago and no one did anything. Why? You know, of course, last year they were talking about the designation issue, but it wasn't something that was being addressed. And he said the attack on the Israeli embassy wasn't viewed as an attack on Argentina, it was an attack on Israel. And the attack on the Jewish Cultural Center, again, was viewed as an attack on Jews. It wasn't viewed as an attack on Argentina. It would be like the 9/11 attack in New York City saying, that's an attack on Wall Street. They didn't attack the United States, Al-Qaeda, no, they're not our enemy. It's Wall Street that you know, has the problem and they can deal with it. That was, in a sense, sort of the way that Argentina approached it afterwards. And you know, was it because they didn't want to deal with the potential implications of a designation, or figured maybe the problem will go away? That I can't tell you, but what's changed is the realization in the world that we live in today, certainly post 9/11, that it may be okay today, but if they're operating in your country, you don't know when that strike's going to happen. And that realization finally came through, and of course the Macri government took action on it.
And you just, you want to say something, Joseph?
Sure. No, I just want to, just to add to what EJ said, in the sense that from the U.S. perspective, right, I think there's been about 20 years of a lapse of where we actually took Latin America at all very seriously. I think the Trump administration has prioritized Latin America probably more than previous administrations going back to the 1980s, really, under President Reagan. And what you see under there is, you know, Iran, Hezbollah has kind of looked at a vacuum in Latin America. So they looked at it as fertile territory, open territory. And as the political ebbs and flows start to shift, Hugo Chavez comes in at the turn of the century. They view him as an ally. He props up this socialist movement all throughout Latin America. Iran attaches itself to that and then gains legitimacy as the Bolivarian movement, as it's called in Latin America, gained its legitimacy as well. What you've seen since about 2013-14 is the pendulum swing back. More conservative governments are coming into power in Latin America. More U.S.-friendly governments and Israel-friendly governments are starting to, and presidents are starting to gain position. And what you've seen is the pushback is starting to happen. Now, it took a while. President Macri of Argentina was elected in 2015. He didn't start office until close to 2016. So it took him pretty much his whole presidency to get to the point where he can designate Hezbollah. These conversations started at the beginning of his presidency, but it took him the whole time because he had to build the coalition around this. And so I think what you're seeing that now that the train has left the station and now we have Paraguay designating, we're working on potentially Brazil, which would complete the tri-border area. Then you have Colombia. And you have
which is a very
countries.
Important area, the tri-border, right?
That's a historic area where Hezbollah has recruited members, operators, and financing more than anything. So I think what we're seeing now is the political pendulum has swung in a pace where the United States has now chosen a very opportune time to engage the region and to focus on building these coalitions that will squeeze Iran and Hezbollah even more.
But the difficulty, and I want to go back to you, EJ, on this, is that drug money is a lot. There's a lot of money there. And then there's a lot of corruption in countries from Central South America. Obviously, there's the Venezuela question, because this is one example where the government actually is the umbrella, is the direct, basically, aid and supporter of these operations. There's a person like Tariq al-Aissami, who is originally from Syria, who is now actually in the lead of the Venezuelan government. In your opinion, what could the United States do? There's a lot of questions about why is the United States not doing enough about Venezuela, but also in terms of the Hezbollah support in Venezuela. What could be done, in your opinion? What is there that the United States, the administration is really serious about the Iranian regime and countering the Iranian regime, could do more to counter them in countries like Venezuela?
Well, I actually would like to defer this one to Joseph, who's focused a little bit more on Venezuela. I will say, though, on the trafficking and the drug trade, the illicit trade, as Joseph has said many times in some of the meetings that we've been in, the question isn't why they're getting, isn't that they're getting this money. The question is why they're getting this money and where that money's going, which, of course, is going back to fund the operations of Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, which underscores the importance of the Trump administration's actions sanctioning Hezbollah officials within the Lebanese government, those working within foreign governments in Latin America, and going after these assets all around the world to squeeze it. Because for so long we have ignored what's happened in our own hemisphere, that this is now having that sort of an impact on it. But I'll let Joseph answer a little bit more on the Venezuela.
Sure, I'll touch on Venezuela in a
Yes.
second. But in the military, there's a saying that says, you know, experts talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. And what we want to look at is we want to look at the logistical network that props up Hezbollah and Iran. Like, how are they getting their money? How are they getting their transportation? How are they getting their communications? And what we're seeing is Latin America plays a major role in the logistics. Just to point out a data point, you know, the Hezbollah has what's called the Unit 910, or External Security Organization, which is the international arm that carries out the terror operations. Was believed to be the #3 operative in the ESO, the Unit 910, is Colombian-born. He's a Colombian-born Lebanese dual citizen who carried out the logistics for the Ami attack in 1994, and who's been carrying out potential plots in Thailand, in Cyprus, and potentially was involved in the Bulgaria bombing in 2013. So this is a major figure in Hezbollah's logistical hierarchy, and he happens to be Latin American. And so that what we've seen is the logistical makeup of what is Hezbollah and Iran rests a lot in Latin America because they're tied to the illicit traffics. If you're going to be involved in cocaine trafficking, you have to be in Latin America. It's wholesale in Latin America. So a $300 billion global industry can put a lot of revenues in your coffers to do terror operations in the Middle East, to carry out proxy wars in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and all this. So Venezuela, where does that fit into this bigger picture? So Venezuela is much like the conversations we're having in the Middle East, another proxy for Iran and Hezbollah. If we look at it in comparison to Syria, right? And there are a lot of comparisons to Syria and Venezuela, despite what others may think. If you look at Well, if you look at Syria today, right? Syria is a largest refugee crisis in the world with tremendous humanitarian concerns, and what claims an increasingly permanent presence of Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and increasingly Turkey.
Yes.
That definition fits Venezuela. It fits Venezuela because what we're learning in Venezuela is much like Syria serves as a critical logistical point for the land bridge between Tehran and Lebanon. Venezuela serves as the air bridge between Tehran and Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, where they need all this logistical support. So much like Hezbollah has defended the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah is always defending the Maduro regime in Venezuela because they don't want to lose that logistical standpoint. They don't want to lose their ability to operate in the Western Hemisphere to the level that they have because they have governments in Latin America that are doing so. So what, I think what we notice in this pivoting a little more to Venezuela on U.S. policy is we kind of underestimated the Venezuela crisis. We thought in 2016 when President Trump began office, we thought that Venezuela was simply a Cuban occupation, a narco state with Cuban occupation. And what we've learned over the years, it's more of a parallel state. It's a proxy state with Cuban, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and Iranian support. And I think that's what the complexities of it is what we're leading into today.
Where does the Turkey comes, the Turkish role, because this is new?
No, it's new in the sense that last year, to go back 2 years ago, 2017, Turkey really had not a lot of involvement in Venezuela, no trade whatsoever. And in 2018, 23.6 tons of gold get shipped from Venezuela to Turkey. And we understand Venezuela has 4th or 5th largest gold reserves in the world. And so Turkey, at the time where its economy is struggling, is importing gold from all over the world, and Venezuela becomes a major supplier. Because of that, Turkey has gotten more increasingly involved in Venezuela in providing humanitarian aid to the regime, and also through an illicit scheme of doing maybe a gold for foods scheme where the gold goes from Venezuela to Turkey, and then payments mysteriously go from Turkey through Singapore into banks in Mexico. That's the food distribution that comes into Venezuela. So it provides Erdogan a tremendous amount of political capital to control the humanitarian assistance that's going to Venezuela to introduce Islamic relief. So Erdogan has become a major player in Venezuela in the crisis, and he is aligned with Iran and Russia.
Aligned with Iran and Russia. I mean, we do know that he did support Maduro during this whole crisis that is still ongoing. I want to ask you, EJ, you know, now we're talking about the Middle East. There is the Israeli airstrikes against the Iranian proxies all over Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon openly. In your opinion, what could the United States' role be in this upcoming issue? I mean, we know that the American administration said that they support Israel and defending itself, but could there be more to do by the administration, by the U.S., in this ongoing and probably escalating situation?
So there probably can be more. However, I would say that the U.S. is providing a lot of support to Israel and its actions, both diplomatically. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended the attacks, not recognizing that Israel carried them out, but the attacks that took place in Iraq and taking place in Syria and in Lebanon, Israel's rights to self-defense. You know, those statements are very important diplomatically. Logistically, I'm sure that the United States is continuing to provide support to Israel. But when it comes to sort of military action, you know, the actual strikes that are taking place, you know, there's sort of a competing things that have to be considered here, which is if the U.S. is actively engaged in it, from a U.S. perspective, what is the direct threat to U.S. national security interests that justify a U.S. strike? Israel clearly has a national security interest in striking these assets in the region. So I think we have to be very careful there. Also, yeah, Israel works and has been working very hard to show itself not to be a proxy of the United States. It doesn't need the U.S.'s permission to defend itself or to carry out a strike. I mean, they've carried out strikes in the past where the U.S. has opposed what Israel was going to do, but you know, we have different interests. While we share a lot, there are still different interests under national security concerns. So that's important. The other factor that needs to really be appreciated, and we've talked in the past about the work that Israel has done and that this administration, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, working with the Arab countries. The Bahraini foreign minister, you know, seemed to lend his support to Israeli actions in the region to counter Iranian influence and aggressiveness. So that cannot be underscored enough how important having Arab states support Israeli attacks in Arab countries going after these Iranian assets. So the U.S. government has done a lot to support this, and it's not coincidental that this is happening as a maximum pressure campaign is coming down on the Iranian regime and its proxies in the region. This is sort of an anticipated outcome. I mean, this is something that when you look at possible outcomes that could happen by imposing these sanctions, this was certainly one that was considered and prepared for.
Quickly, I wanted to ask you, EJ, again, just about a point you mentioned earlier when you said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called for Gantz to join in the national security briefing. Could that play a role in any upcoming, and I know that this is, you know, going off topic, but this, I mean, this big conflict that now probably escalating in the region, could that potentially reflect if in case we saw a right-wing win in Israeli elections, but a possibility maybe reconciliation and creating some sort of united government with the center? By Gantz. I mean,
it could. You know, what's interesting in Israeli politics, I mean, this election and quite frankly, the one that happened beginning of this year in April, it wasn't about the Iran issue. They weren't debating that. Everyone in Israel knows what needs to be done with Iran, that they're an enemy that can't be allowed to continue.
You think it's the same strength? The right and the center have the same views and posture towards the Iranian regime?
I wouldn't say exactly the same, but the understanding, there's no dispute over the fact that Iran is an ideological threat to the Jewish state's existence. Yeah. So in that respect, I don't believe that it would have an impact, you know, from that. But I do believe that if there is a major war that is or is going to break out, in Israel, they do tend to unify when there is an existential threat to the Jewish people's survival and the Jewish state's survival. So there is a possibility that that will happen. I mean, the polls take them for what they're worth. Seems like it will be a similar result in a few weeks to what it was back in April. And if the current Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to make a coalition with the Blue-White Party, you would have a very strong mandate to carry out, you know, these sorts of actions. So it, you know, to answer your question, yes, this could lead to a sort of a reconciliation, but it would have to be because of an existential necessity.
Going back to the issue, in the United States, there's also operations and some activities for Hezbollah that were being uncovered, and that they're probably some ongoing, and some sleeping cells. Tell us a little bit more about that, because this is very, I mean, it's dangerous when we're talking about that, and we have the open border issue. So tell us a little bit more about this
Hezbollah
issue.
operates like a mafia, right? So like the Italian mafia before it, the Irish mafia, the Russian mob, they use communities. They use the Arab communities, particularly Lebanese communities, and they infiltrate those communities. They've used familial pressures, the political pressures. They use corrupting mechanisms through their laundering. They try to corrupt your business so that your business is tied to laundering mechanisms. They try to corner the community so that it has no choice but to operate with Hezbollah. Now in Latin America, they have a lot of success because it's a very corrupt region in and of itself. In the United States, they have less of a success, but they have pockets, right? In Michigan, in North Carolina, in Texas, where they'd be able to corner certain communities and certain businesses and then use those for operations. Now, what the United States is doing now is just discovering more of this, and what's increasingly happening as you're kind of discovering and unraveling this onion that is Hezbollah illicit operations in the United States. They're finding it's tied to illicit operations in Africa, it's tied to illicit operations in Latin America. This famous Project Cassandra that hit the news, correct, right? So that was...
Tell us a little bit more about Cassandra as you speak, just because some of our viewers might not know.
So Project Cassandra was a DEA operation to undercover an illicit trafficking ring by Hezbollah, and what they found, it was tied to a Lebanese-Colombian drug trafficker that was major. His name was Ayman Juma, and he was moving multi-tons of cocaine and laundering multi-million dollars through a used car scheme. So they would buy used cars in Africa and sell these used cars in the United States. So they had to co-opt used car lots in the United States, and they obviously have to buy out used car companies in Africa. But the money all that money that was circulating was to launder the proceeds of illicit drug trafficking between Mexican cartels, particularly Los Zetas, and Hezbollah out of Colombia.
And President Obama stopped this operation.
So what happened is that the DA got really intense into this investigation. They found out, I mean, there's things that we still haven't known publicly. There was involvement of the Venezuelan government, involvement of the Bolivian government, and so there was all kinds of things that were just, and this happened. Were discovered, and this happened not very favorable to the Obama administration during the Iran nuclear deal. And so as all these discussions were being had on the Iran nuclear deal, if this were to be revealed at the highest levels of the U.S. government, it would hamper negotiations with the Iranian government. So at least according to some investigations here in Washington, there was pressure put by the Obama administration on law enforcement to say, table that for now and then push it back. And what happened is, I mean, for operative law enforcement officials, they don't look at the politics of it. They see bad guys doing bad things, and they're like, why can't we go after them? So what Trump administration did is he reopened the whole thing. It's not called Project Cassandra anymore. It's called the Hezbollah Financing and Narcoterrorism Team. It's housed at the Department of Justice. It's led by the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Cronin, and they've done a tremendous effort. They just indicted a major Hezbollah operative in New York named Ali Karani in May of this year. Ali Karani was tied to Hezbollah operatives in Latin America and Africa. So they're going back to unraveling that onion and trying to showcase that Hezbollah has an international enterprise. And that's why I think the Treasury's term of it, Hezbollah Incorporated, is the best way to describe it, because while it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's the mothership, they have subsidiaries all over the world. They're carrying out their operations for them.
And this is ongoing right now. There are investigations and possible eruption of these cells.
The case that I'm still involved with in Peru, that's part of the same thing. It's part of the same Hezbollah illicit operations. I think what we're going to see a lot more pressure of over in the months to come is more understanding of Hezbollah's operations in Venezuela. Because to this day, it's been very opaque. It's been very gray. There hasn't been a lot of evidence that has showcased in the judicial manner about Hezbollah's operations in Venezuela. But I think that's going to change, because there's plenty of evidence there. They're tied to indictments. They're tied to investigations. Most of those are sealed. But when they become unsealed, you mentioned, for instance, earlier, Tarek al-Assami. Tarek al-Assami is the current minister in Venezuela, former vice president. And this individual is a major, major money launderer. He's wanted by ICE, Homeland Security. He's also under an indictment from the Department of Justice in Eastern District in New York, or Southern District in New York. And so if that investigation gets unsealed, I think you're going to find a lot about what Hezbollah has been doing, not just in Latin America, but here in the United States as well.
Very interesting. I mean, we're going to be waiting to hear more about this ongoing thing. And we know that since the Obama administration's time, there's a lot more activity to the Iranian regime, even here in Washington. think tanks and other operations, etc., to help the Iranian regime in the media. And we know that there was some threats to the FDD recently, the Federation for Defense of Democracy. I've had the pleasure of having many of their experts on my show. But I mean, for the Iranian regime to threaten a think tank based in Washington, D.C., a think tank that is based on American independent analysts and researchers and experts, is unprecedented. What do you think the appropriate response should be to this form of threat? And basically, I mean, what could it mean?
Well, it shows the desperation of the Iranians. I mean, obviously, our law enforcement and intelligence community is, I'm sure, working with FDD to ensure the safety of those that work there. I think Senator Cruz, who was also sanctioned by the Iranian regime recently.
It's so funny to hear the word sanctioned. What does that mean?
Well,
you're not allowed to visit.
Right, he is not allowed to visit, and his spokesperson, and I'll paraphrase, said, that the senator has a policy of not visiting countries that take Americans hostage. So, the practical implications of a sanction like that isn't going to have much, but they're trying to build themselves up and put themselves on par with a world leader like the United States by saying, we can sanction you as much as you can sanction us. Of course, the typical response is to laugh at it, but the threat that they pose is real. And, as you mentioned with the sleeper cells operating in this country, going back to the Venezuela issue and what the U.S. can do, as Joseph pointed out, this isn't just the Maduro regime or Maduro and Cuban intelligence working there. You've got the Russians, the Chinese, you've got Iran, you've got Hezbollah, and you've got Turkey and possibly others interested in what's going on there. We're very cautious in a sense because of these cells that are operating in the United States that can be activated at a moment's notice. And
there were attempts by the Iranian regime to target people who are critical of the Iranian regime in other countries around the world, including in Europe.
They tried to kill a Saudi ambassador in 2013 here in the
United
States.
Here in Washington. I mean,
right, and they don't play by the rules of war,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's something that we're obviously very well aware of and taking action to defend against it. But that is definitely a consideration when looking at the Venezuela problem, is exactly how best to resolve it while maintaining our security. And because we were asleep at the wheel for so long, we have a lot to catch up on.
I think just to add to what EJ is saying, I think we underestimate how important Latin America is to Iran because we focus so much on the Middle East, right?
Yes.
We look at what they're doing in the Middle East. Now for Israel, obviously, what's going along in Syria and Lebanon, that's very important because it's right around their near abroad.
Yes.
But for the United States, what goes on in the Middle East is important, but what goes on in Latin America is deadly.
Yes.
We need to understand that Latin America, next to their near abroad, next to the Middle East, is probably the most important region that they have because Iran has figured out through all the entire episodes of the revolution that they have a geographic disadvantage with the United States. And then when they look to their left and their right, Afghanistan and Iraq, they see U.S. presence. But in order to be able to equal that, they're going to have to diminish their geographic disadvantage. That means they're going to have to be able to threaten the United States the way they believe that the United States threatens them. The way they do that, they can't send carriers to the Caribbean. So the way they do that is they send proxies, they send spies, they send subversive elements to Latin America. Now, this has been happening for more than 30 years. So now they've gotten to a point where they have governments under their control, namely Venezuela and Bolivia, but there's others as well. And what we're seeing is many things that have happened in the Middle East in terms of migrants, terrorists, humanitarian concerns, happening itself in Latin America. Venezuela, at the end of the day, is the #1 national security concern for the United States because of the migration issue. It's at 4.5 million right now. Next year, there's projections that, according to the Organization of American States, that it could hit anywhere between 6.5 to 8.5 million. That's Syria-level numbers.
Yes.
It will surpass Syria probably by next year. But that migration is not going to hit to Europe. It's going to hit to the United States.
Yes.
And when that dovetails with the Central American migrant problem that we all hear about here in Washington on the news, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to do something desperate. And that's what Iran's banking on. Iran's banking on that they're going to be able to position themselves in Latin America, that they're going to force the Trump administration to do something desperate in Venezuela and delegitimize the Trump administration around the world. So they're playing geopolitics at a global scale, and they are relying on Latin America to be part of their one of their most important chess pieces. And I think unless we get that, unless we understand that, and more importantly, unless we stop that, we may fall into that trap.
I mean, it's interesting to hear that, you know, it's something desperate to delegitimize the Trump administration, even though a lot of people are basically critical of the Trump administration not doing enough in Venezuela.
Yeah.
That they're asking for maybe a joint operation somehow against the Maduro regime.
But how would that play out? How would a joint military operation play out in Venezuela? Yeah, we could get Maduro out. That's not probably that difficult to do, much like we got Saddam out in Iraq. But what happened in Iraq after 15 years? Iran comes in, and I think Iran's breaking on very much the same thing. That we come out, we get Maduro out. The rest of Latin America looks at us like an occupying aggressive force, and then slowly the politics starts to shift, and then Iran starts to prop up their elements, Tariq al-Assami and others that can take control of those countries. So they're playing the long game with very short-term actions. The Trump administration needs to understand wars aren't fought that way anymore. We're not going to beat Iran with an aircraft carrier. We're going to beat Iran when we make the world understand that they are essentially a revolution with borders, and that they're trying to aggressively co-opt and corrupt many countries in the world to be able to spark their Islamic revolution.
You know, lastly, it's their drug laundering, you know, money laundering channels that they have. It doesn't necessarily just come to the United States. It's in Europe. It's in Africa. Isn't that correct? It's in Canada.
It is in Canada. Yeah.
So, I mean, how could the administration go about in cutting these ties? Because, like you said, if you want to suffocate this regime, you really want to cut off the oxygen. The administration is successful. I mean, we heard Secretary Pompeo was saying that in July, Iran only exported 400,000 barrels of oil. This is a really very, very small amount compared to what they need to survive. But what could more be done?
Well, I think the designations that are taking place now in Latin America are extremely important, but we also need to be putting more pressure on Europe, on European countries, the European Union, the UN Security Council. You know, these are ways to put the pressure on, and it's going to take time, obviously. I mean, the UN Security Council to try to get Russia and China to get on board with these is a challenge, but there's ways to do it, and I think looking at Latin America and the, I would say, success already, and hopefully over the next 6 months, we're able to see possibly Brazil, possibly Colombia, Guatemala, maybe Honduras. Yeah, I mean, there's others that could potentially designate them. We'll send a very clear message to the Iranians, to Hezbollah, that they're going to be squeezed even more, and that can help to tackle this problem in our own hemisphere.
I think what the Trump administration needs to do is they need to articulate how Iran operates around the world, which is through an alliance. Iran doesn't operate by itself. Iran operates increasingly with Russia, increasingly also with China through the oil sales, an unconventional alliance with Turkey, with Erdogan particularly, and obviously with Latin America and all the elements down there. So they have to break up that alliance.
What about Europe, which is what EJ mentioned?
Well, I mean, that same alliance operates in Europe. Right? That alliance, which we at the center, we call it the VRIC, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, China. That alliance operates globally, and they back each other up. They back each other up in through political forums such as the UN Security Council, or through local politics or local movements. Where I think we could have the most success at breaking that alliance up is Latin America. I think we can drive a wedge between Russia and Iran to showcase that China and Iran aren't natural allies, or Turkey and Iran, which are historically adversaries. We have to drive that narrative, and we have to break up that wedge up, because when we deal with just Iran, they're containable. But when we deal with Iran, with all of its international actors, it becomes a very difficult challenge for not just the United States, but for the international community. So I think we need to break up that alliance, and we need to show that we can do that. I think Latin America is probably our best bet to do it.
I think we're going to be eagerly waiting to hear more about this unraveling of the Iranian regime and its proxies around the world. Thank you so much, both. I'd love to have you on again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.